My name is Michelle Morales. I'm the president of Woods Fund Chicago. We are a private foundation in Chicago that funds organizing and advocacy within Chicago proper. And welcome to today's discussion around the upcoming Supreme Court decisions regarding affirmative action and DACA. This conversation today is going to really focus on the affirmative action decision that is upcoming in June. As we are probably all predicting with the state of our Supreme Court and the conservative tilt of the Supreme Court, that more than likely affirmative action will be rolled back. And so we know, right, that once again, fundamental constitutional rights are again at stake. And these decisions threaten to thwart progress that has been made towards equality, equity, and justice. And so part of the discussion today is to help philanthropic leaders figure out what they need to be ready to address the impact of these decisions on movement and nonprofit partners, communities, and foundations. At Woods Fund, like probably so many foundations here at NFG this week, we are very explicit about race. We're very explicit on funding and supporting BIPOC-led, centered, serving organizations. We actually also use race to determine funding. So we have a whole thing where we ask for demographics and we actually pay attention to that to determine who we're going to fund. That all is going to be threatened, right, with this potential decision. We've made a decision as a foundation to continue being explicit, regardless of the Supreme Court decision. And that was a conversation we had with our attorney and also with our board and our staff. But this session today is really for all of you to really think through what you're going to need as philanthropic staff and leaders to help your foundations come to those decisions as well. And so what I want to do is pass it to the panelists. We have one panelist in person, two on Zoom, for them to introduce themselves, and then we'll get into the content of the session. So I'm going to pass it to Miranda.
Thank you so much, and thank you everyone who joined us today. My name is Miranda Migueli. My pronouns are she, her. I serve as the Director of Policy and Programs at Women's Funding Network. We are a member organization and high impact intermediary. Most of our members are US based, but we're a global organization made up of women's funds, gender equity funders, and allies. And we work at the intersection of gender equity and racial equity. I am a lawyer by training, so I started off practicing in a holistic public defense office. And I raise that because there's so many intersections between the work of philanthropy and the law in today's discussion. I was not a Supreme Court practitioner, but anyway, there's that connection anyway. So happy to be in this conversation.
Susan, if you're ready, if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. It's good to zoom in. I'm Susan Taylor Batten, President and CEO of the Association of Black Foundation Executives, also known as ADFE. We are a philanthropic partnership for Black communities. For those of you that don't know us very high level, our work really focuses on who gets to lead in this sector, particularly as it relates to the C-suite, and where the money is going in this sector, all relative to Black communities. We're a membership association of foundation leaders and nonprofits. We have a membership of just under 2,000 around the US, and I am so looking forward to this conversation. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Marissa?
Hi, everyone. It's nice to be joining you from Brooklyn, New York, in Lenape territory. My name is Marissa Torona, and I'm the president of Grantmakers Concerned with Immigrants and Refugees. My pronouns are she, her. GSER, which is the shorthand for our organization, is a philanthropic mobilizing organization that creates strategic opportunities to move money and power to immigrant, migrant, and refugee communities. Excited to be on this panel today to talk about the intersections from a multitude of vantage points, and really grateful to be on this panel with Michelle, Miranda, and Susan.
Thank you all so much. So Susan, you're kind of up first. If you can spend about 15 minutes letting us know what's at stake and how is ABFE gearing up and organizing its members to address this issue?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Michelle. And again, I can't tell you all how I am really appreciative of being in this conversation because we are in the thick of it, and we are in need of, and I personally, some thoughts, ideas, lessons. Miranda, I can't wait to hear from you. I don't doubt that what we have on our agenda at ADFI probably will be tweaked by this conversation today. Is real time. What is at stake, as we know, are, my gosh, the rollback, the potential rollback. While this is focusing in on higher ed, of course, we've been talking to education funders specifically about the focus of the case in front of the Supreme Court on higher ed. There are huge losses there, but we know that. And also, I should say, with higher education, we're extremely concerned about historical Black colleges and universities. We just released a report 2 weeks ago that shows what we all knew to be true, but now we've got the data, the huge disparities in funding to Black colleges in comparison to predominantly white institutions. Yet these institutions are so important to our young people, to our communities. So we're concerned about HBCUs as well. But, as Michelle laid out, the concern is that this will, while the case is centered on higher ed, it just will have a ripple effect across a number of other sectors. So some of the things that, have been on our mind at ADFI, clearly Black organizations of color, being faced with lawsuits and challenges. These are organizations, you all know, that are already fragile given the disinvestment by foundations and the public sector, quite frankly. So just that scary moment, and we have faced ours, where you open the mail and there's this really intimidating letter challenging you, legally, because you are focused on Black people or people of color, and don't have the resources, right? Don't have the resources to gain legal counsel and fight back. Also worried, and we've seen a lot of this, around the de-emphasizing of intentionality around race. Michelle, you mentioned that. I'm concerned, colleagues, about this with organizations and nonprofits themselves, right? I want to say it was back in 2018, we were doing a report we produced called Redlining, by another name. And again, sort of making the case for further investment in Black institutions. And when we got to speak with about 100 Black-led nonprofits around the US, and we wanted to create a database and list them as Black-led and founded nonprofits, several actually chose not to, and you all hear these stories, several chose not to be a part of this database. And even so far as people revising mission statements and, wording on their website, because these attacks, while we're waiting for this pending decision, you all know this has been going on for quite some time. So, the concern about the de-emphasizing of Blackness or, folks of color within the organizations that are here to serve our communities is something that we have to care about, and I think is a risk. And then also just the, risk-adverse foundations, pulling back from the explicit focus on race. And Michelle, you laid it out. I'm hearing more and more conversations, within the network and outside of our network, about the reframing, the implicit versus explicit focus on race. And I think more work will be done implicitly, and I think we have to talk about what that means in this sector, because I already see foundations in fear of what's coming, even just navigating the current political landscape on race, becoming more implicit in their work. Clearly, leading organizations won't do that, but there are some that are actually considering it. It's actually happening And then the last thing I would just speak to are threats to our work to increase representation of Black people and people of color in this sector, right? So any focus that foundations are taking on grant making, vendor selection, quite frankly, workforce diversity, we have to think about all those things. So high level, those are just some thoughts that have been on our mind at AbbVie in terms of what's going on right now and the work that we're doing. This has been a longstanding conversation amongst the AbbVie board. Probably last year, we started bringing in movement leaders just to speak with the board at AbbVie to talk about, really it was then just current threats around explicit focus on race. This was not necessarily about the Supreme Court decision, but we know that, you know, those conversations have heightened since we're all waiting for this decision to come down. Ongoing conversations with the Umoja Circle, which is a network that we organize at AbbVie of Black Foundation CEOs. Again, sort of engaging movement leaders about currently what's happening vis-a-vis attacks on, you know, Black-led organizations and what folks think is actually coming down the pike. And so all of that, colleagues, has led to a set of conversations that we are now undergoing at AbbVie. And I'll talk about them a little bit. One was a convening of Foundation Legal Counsel in April. We had a meeting of about 10 foundations represented and their legal counsel, specifically talking about again, navigating issues of race and sort of scenario planning around the Supreme Court decision. And so I'll come back to what came out of that in a minute, because it leads into strategy that we're thinking about and want to talk to so many of you about. That meeting happened in April. The next meeting up is one of Foundation CEOs, will occur either late May or early June. And it's specifically focused on, again, getting CEOs to think about scenario planning around this issue. We found that, you know, individual foundations were having conversations. We even found that some foundations have hired consultants to literally sort of look at this decision and then give advice, right, to the foundation about how to navigate this. But we weren't until now with NFG and a few others. I'm starting to see across, you know, field conversations. So this meeting is coming up, co-hosted by myself and the MacArthur Foundation, John Palfrey, and is also now backed by Hispanics in Philanthropy, Native Americans in Philanthropy, and Asian American and Pacific Islanders in Philanthropy. That's a upcoming meeting to gather information about what foundations are thinking about and what we should be doing in the field. And then the last meeting is a conversation with civil rights attorneys themselves, just to sort of hear from them about how they're preparing and taking their advice about what philanthropy needs to be doing and thinking about, right? So given the discussions that have happened over the past, I'd say, year, there are a few things pending in terms of strategy that we're moving forward with. One is in the area of legal support. We are looking to seed a fund to provide resources for legal counsel for Black-led organizations and organizations led by people of color. We know that this has to come with increased funding to these organizations as well, because we still have to address the giving gap, if you will. But just the sort of resources to connect to legal counsel, we've heard over and over that this is something that needs to be done. So we're exploring funds that do exist and how we may build on them, or again, create yet another resource. And have had several foundations that have agreed to help seed this fund. So there's some good news there. The second is really just organizing a bank of resources and information for nonprofits and foundations. Again, this is still in the legal space. Law firms, right? Several foundations are using law firms that have this, specialty around nonprofit law and civil rights. And when we talked to the legal counsels last month, they're still trading information about what law firms are using that have this particular area of expertise. So we want to pull that information together. Also pull more information together about pro bono legal counsel. We know that some groups, Lawyers for Black Lives exist. There are a number of groups out there. So we want to, again, touch base and figure out how we build on and help organize for foundations and nonprofits, information about pro bono attorneys. And then the other, in terms of sort of organizing what I'm calling a resource bank in a very simple way, are strategies around messaging for foundations in particular. I have, about doing work on race. I've seen colleagues over the last couple of months, more foundations tripped up, right, end up in the news about the good and explicit work they're doing on race and racial equity and funding to our communities, but the messaging is just off. And we know that messaging matters. And so, again, the sort of reorganizing of messaging frameworks for foundations in this moment, we think is important. Just a few last points. When we had that meeting with legal counsels in April, I actually believe, colleagues, that organizing and networking of foundation legal counsel has to be a strategy moving forward. It's just got to be a strategy moving forward. They are holding the power and advising CEOs, right, on these issues. They have, some are being very strategic and creative, being intentional about connecting people of color-led organizations to legal counsel. I've seen other practice that I worry a bit about, some literally redrafting proposals that come in from grantees that are explicit on race and framing it in ways that don't raise flags. And, it's an attempt by foundations to cover grantees and cover themselves, but I worry about that kind of cover, quite frankly. What became so clear was the huge disconnect between what I know to be foundations that have programmatic staff that are leading on these issues of racial justice and, explicitly calling out race, and the attorneys within these foundations, right, that are protecting the foundation, right? There are huge disconnects. And so, again, that's why organizing a foundation legal counsel, some development, networking, I think, has got to be part of the strategy moving forward. And then the last piece of the strategy that we have on the table are additional resources to civil rights groups, right, that are working to defend nonprofits and foundations on these issues. So those strategy ideas, colleagues, are what we are taking to the convening of CEOs and asking for some support on. And again, this is AbbVie, along with HIP, APIP, and Native Americans in Philanthropy. Narrative and communications, let me say a bit about that. We do think we need to invest in communication strategy to help funders and nonprofits understand how to navigate this current climate. We think communication strategies are necessary pre and post the SCOTUS decision, right? So right now, I think we've got to figure out how to get information out, saying to folks like, don't stop, because we know this is coming, like, don't stop what you do and keep going. And post decision, helping foundations sort of think through, now that we know what we know, how do we continue to do the work? So as part of, again, a comprehensive strategy, we're thinking about communications as well. the last thing I'll say is I think there's a need for just more general funder education around where the attacks are coming from. Again, these are attacks on, the explicit work of racial justice, to, organizations led by people of color that take this on. We know that the attacks are well organized, they are well funded, and we think philanthropy needs to, that are in our networks, needs to know more about that, right? The ecosystem of funders and strategies that have organized to attack the work that we are trying to do and attempt to thwart our progress. So I'll stop there and look forward to more conversation.
Thank you so much, Susan. I really appreciate especially the note that you landed on and hope. I think everyone in the room, right, agrees and knows that this is a concerted effort on behalf of the right, just like the, rolling back of Dobbs, right? And this is now, so we also need to think about a concerted effort and how we can align and organize as philanthropy to protect the communities that so many of us are a part of and the communities we support and serve. So we're going to pass it to Miranda now. And so I have the question for you is, so what did the Women's Funding Network do to prepare and organize? What lessons can be learned from Dobbs as we carry forward? And then secondly, what has the philanthropy landscape looked like post-Dobbs in terms of moving money? I think, right, we have already a precedent. What happened, right, with the rolling back of Dobbs, and sort of what did philanthropy do around that might also set the stage for the potential rollback of affirmative action?
Thank you, Michelle. I'll just start by saying I joined the Women's Funding Network, or WFN, in January 2022, and preparation for the likely reversal of Roe was well underway. And I think that can be attributed to listening to and taking seriously movement leadership who told us this was coming, to earlier discussions that this is a concerted effort, a decades-long effort underway that led to the reversal of Roe and some of the other issues that we're seeing. In some ways, we had a unique opportunity in terms of preparation with the reversal of Roe because of the leaked Dobbs decision, which ended up closely mirroring the actual decision. So while our organization and partners weren't starting from scratch or necessarily surprised by the leak did create a sense of urgency in philanthropic and other spaces that we were able to leverage in our organizing and preparation. And around the time of the link decision and working closely with our members and collaborators like Groundswell Fund, Ms. Foundation for Women, Funders for Justice, Funders for Reproductive Equity, along with change partners like ABFI, Funders for LGBTQ issues and others, we drafted and we released a philanthropic pledge in advance of the decision, actually. And we were able to begin work on our communication strategy. Susan lifted up the importance of communications. So we were able to do that in advance of the decision. So we had something in place for decision day and beyond. And in our philanthropic pledge, which we really wanted to create as an important statement, an opportunity to collaborate in a particular moment, but also as a way to guide our steps as we move forward in this decades-long fight around bodily autonomy, we raised 5 immediate actions that philanthropy at large could take in response to the Dobbs decision. And I actually think that these are relevant in today's discussion and that they can serve as lessons that we can really carry forward. And the first is giving now and giving with trust. So whether we're talking about supporting movement leaders and organizations on the front lines of reproductive justice, affirmative action, or DACA, this recommendation is relevant. We really need to be supporting and giving in a trust-based way to meet the moment. we asked that philanthropy at large consider things like shortening applications, removing reporting requirements, but also funding organizations that are below the radar. So we saw and were able to predict a surge in funding to organizations like Planned Parenthood, NARAL, which is incredibly important. But we need to also think about grassroots, frontline, BIPOC-led organizations that are doing the work on local levels. Our next call to action was to listen to movement leadership. And I'll just reflect back on this morning's session on funder organizing. Jatane Davis, and I apologize if I'm mispronouncing her name, talked about how funder organizing shouldn't happen in isolation and without relationship with people doing the work and most impacted by the issue. And it also, she talked about, offers an opportunity for real-time feedback to adjust strategy. And I think that is really crucial in the Dobbs situation, but also in other contexts, because when you have a reversal of decades of legal precedent, it's really can be chaotic, and there's definitely shifting landscape. So having that opportunity and those relationships to rely on really helps to improve and iterate as you move forward as funders. Our third recommendation was around planning for the future while acknowledging the past. So in the context of Roe, folks in the reproductive justice space talk about abortion as the floor, not the ceiling. But part of how the Dobbs decision happened was a focus on abortion access as opposed to the broader reproductive justice framework. So I think there's something to be said about starting and planning and strategizing in the context of history so that we don't repeat mistakes as we move forward. Fourth, we talked about asking philanthropy to collaborate across strategies and issues. And I think Susan really brought up this point really eloquently. So we have to collaborate. It's not just about grant making, but it's also about the legal strategy. It's also about the communication strategy. It's general counsels, it's program people. So it's that type of collaboration. But also we heard about concerted efforts from the right. So there's also collaboration across issue area, reproductive justice, racial equity, immigration justice. That type of collaboration is critical if we're going to move forward. And last but not least, in our philanthropic pledge, we talked about investing long-term in existent movement infrastructure. So now is not the time to recreate, to go to places where there's existing folks doing the work and not be in conversation with them. And just like there's decades-long effort that got us to this position where affirmative action is going to be overturned, where Roe was overturned, and it's not clear what's going to happen with the DACA program. It's going to take years and long-term, flexible, deep investment. This is a long game that we're talking about. So next I'll talk a little bit from my view, what has the philanthropy landscape looked like post-Dobbs regarding moving money. And we saw some things that were encouraging. Dobbs and even the leaked decision served as a wake-up call and led to an influx of support in abortion and reproductive justice organizations. We saw what some folks called rage giving from individual donors and on the funder level. As an example, in the 24 hours that followed the Dobbs decision, Planned Parenthood Federation of America and their action fund saw a 40-fold increase in donations compared to a typical day, and more than half of that coming from new donors. We also saw major funders expand and deepen their commitment to reproductive justice and abortion rights, including some who were new into the space, and others had been moving money in this space for years. So Groundswell Funds, who we work closely with, for instance, they've targeted to move $100 million by 2025. And so in addition to deepening investment of grant-making dollars, we also see some really interesting things happening in terms of diversification of investment. So I believe many folks in the room might be familiar with the work of Erica Seth Davies, who's formerly of AbbVie, who started Ria Ventures, which is, it's more than an investment firm, but essentially an investment firm that works in impact investing in the space of reproductive justice. Also recently, the Bridgespan Group released a report on existing and possibilities around impact investing and reproductive justice. It covers the work of Ria Ventures and others. So again, there's really some positive trends we're seeing in terms of deepened and diversified funding in the reproductive justice space. But what remains to be seen is whether this investment is long-term, which is required to undo the harm of the role reversal and broader attacks on bodily autonomy. I think also there's sort of diversification in funding in terms of flexible capital, venture capital, impact investing, along with grant making. But what I think is important to pay attention to is diversification of the types of collateral consequences of the Roe decision. And by that, I mean, I probably didn't say that well, you know, there's digital security issues. There's physical security issues. Monica Simpson of Sister Song has to have security. You can't do this work and not have a secure website. You have to be careful about your pictures on the website. You don't want to get doxxed. So there's the communications piece, there's the legal support. And because this is playing out, at least in the reproductive justice space on a local and state level, you need to have, be able to have local and state responses. So this is more than diversified funding in the space of policy work, legal advocacy, and programmatic work. It's really nuanced, local, and shifting. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. We're now going to hear from Marissa from GSER. And so Marissa, if you can lay out for us what's at stake and how is GSER gearing up and organizing its members?
Great, thanks, Michelle. You'll probably hear from me share some strategies you've already heard from Miranda and Susan. So it's just a re-amplification of things that we know are working in many different places. But just a really quick explainer for those who aren't familiar with DACA. It's Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, and it was established in 2012 through a memorandum in the Obama administration. And it's a policy that provides work authorization protection from deportation to immigrants who arrived in the U.S. at a young age. It has been remarkably successful over the last 10 years. Nearly 900,000 young people who have qualified for its work authorizations and protections at some point, but it's also limited, temporary, and under imminent legal threat. So unlike the case that's coming to the docket in June to SCOTUS, we imagine it'll happen more likely in 2024. But before I get there, let me just kind of give you the current status of it, right? So renewals are still available to those who are currently recipients of DACA, but there are no new applications that are being accepted. So as I shared, there are more than 800,000 or so young people who over the course of DACA have been able to benefit from it. But that means that currently there are approximately 400,000 young people in the United States who can't even apply for it now because of the current litigation. So where it stands is that there's a case in the Texas District Court right now before a judge named Andrew Hannon who's considering the legality of the DACA program. So how did we get here? Well, since the establishment of DACA back in 2012, there's been a lot that's been happening in the courts. And so I think both of my colleagues talked about having legal strategies. That is so critical because the ways in which the opposition has succeeded in trying to undermine DACA is from a very strategic and long-term strategy around where applications or motions are filed, right? Because they are looking for favorable judges. So just sort of, again, underscoring what my colleagues have already shared around thinking about legal strategy. So where we are now is that in late 2022, the Fifth Circuit of Appeals agreed with this Texas trial court judge, finding that DACA was created unlawfully, but sent the case back to the district court judge to consider a new rule that the Biden administration put into place in late 2022, which shifted the policy from a memorandum to a rule. So it doesn't make it fully law, but it gives it a little bit more fortification and strengthening. However, Congress had the option in late 2022 in December to adopt a legislative solution, right? Something that's actually binding beyond a memorandum or a rule for DACA holders before they went into recess, and they didn't do that. Solution available to DACA holders. 9 states challenged the new rule that the Biden administration established in late 2022 in the same Texas court, again, sort of leaning into that legal strategy of finding favorable courts for their applications. So right now, the Biden administration is requesting that if the Texas court rules against DACA, that judge not immediately eliminate all aspects of it, like potentially parse out certain parts of it, maybe limit his decision to the state of Texas, or only strike down work authorizations and allow the administration to define any wind down timeline. So, as you can imagine, right, there are hundreds of thousands of young people, family members who are in a state of flux and unknowingness because of the current sort of judicial undertakings that are happening right now, particularly in the district court, and will likely go to the 5th court. So given that both this Texas District Court judge and the 5th Circuit have previously ruled that DACA was unconstitutional, mostly on procedural grounds, it's widely accepted, right, and expected that the same district court judge will also rule it unconstitutional, even with this new, more formal rule that the Biden administration established, and that the administration will then in turn likely appeal the decision back to the 5th Circuit, which is again also expected to rule against DACA, which will then set the stage for an additional appeal to SCOTUS. And so again, we don't think that the Supreme Court would come up with any decision before June 2024. So field leaders are already working on the assumption that DACA will likely be struck down. So a couple of things to think about. From an impact standpoint, right, the immediate impact will depend on this particular district court judge's ruling. And of course, the Biden administration will likely seek immediate relief from any aspect of that decision, especially whatever, if there's a particularly drastic sort of section in his ruling, whatever that might be. But more importantly and more significantly, and this is why, we're coming to you to have this conversation, in the long term, if DACA is terminated, hundreds of thousands of individuals and their families will be vulnerable to deportation and lose the ability to lawfully work in the United States as their work authorizations expire. So there's a couple of different things that both movement and others are thinking about in terms of strategies, anticipating this scenario in June or whatever, 2024. So one is, we've got Senators Durbin and Graham, who reintroduced DREAM Act legislation in 2023 to provide that sort of legislative relief and finality that DACA recipients are hoping for. It is largely symbolic because it isn't going to pass, given the current state of the political situation in Washington, D.C. We're also contending with the fact that with the expiration of Title 42 tomorrow, and the likely intense media attention related to that, what's described as the border crisis, and I put that in quotes because that's not a great narrative at all, but that is how the media tends to talk about these issues. It will likely render any positive movement on immigration, including DACA, almost impossible, especially as we're looking at the election cycles of 2024. I'm really sorry. I feel like I'm a bummer as I'm saying all of this, but I really do want to give the realistic context of what we're grappling with. Not surprisingly, though, movement and field are ready, and they have strategies in place. To the point that I think Miranda spoke to very directly, and Susan, I think it was embedded in your comments as well. Investing over the long term in infrastructure and the connections between organizations and how they work together is what's going to sustain us, even as these losses tend to accumulate. So a couple of things. There is, of course, the ability, because it's in the court system, to mount a legal defense, right? Amicus briefs will be filed, and other movement strategies related to maybe the finer points of whatever the judge's decisions are will be mounted, and folks are ready for that. But let's talk about, I want to talk about in a little bit, building the conditions necessary for a win in the long term. But what I'll pivot to is just the sort of plans for termination, right? So a couple of strategies, 3 in particular, that I want to highlight that are really coming from our movement and field partners. One is, and I can't underscore this enough, to support and invest in the mental health and well-being of both DACA holders and their families, right? As I mentioned before, to be in that constant state of flux as to what your status is within the United States, knowing that the work authorization and sort of protection from deportation will likely be decertified. I don't know if that's the right term, in 2024. I mean, it takes its toll on people, and I'm saying it in a simplistic way, and I don't mean to, because it's actually incredibly critical to invest in, again, the mental health and well-being. Our friends at Immigrants Rising, as an example, have done a number of series and trainings about understanding and for DACA recipients around understanding and accessing mental health resources. And United We Dream has an UndocuHealth initiative, which is focused specifically on this issue. So again, want to sort of raise that strategy to the top. Also want to talk about what's important in terms of investing in legal services and legal strategies to explore other possible immigration remedies. DACA is one of many, and there are other immigration legal remedies that are available. Our friends at places like National Immigrant Law Center and Immigrant Legal Resource Center are actively educating individuals, communities, and other organizations around what those possible remedies are. What we're also heartened by is that there's a lot of activity on college campuses in particular, because that's where a lot of DACA recipients, right, spend a lot of their time, for those that are in college, and investing in ensuring that they have access to understanding what all the possible remedies are is also really critical. So those are 2 strategies. And the third one, and one, for example, we held a webinar on at GSER about, is helping to invest in workforce participation strategies that do not require work authorization, right? So entrepreneurship is a really great example. Again, our friends at Immigrants Rising had a wonderful webinar about income generation through entrepreneurship. And then our webinar that we hosted in April, which we'll share as part of the post-panel discussion resources, was about those employment-based immigration remedies that we, even as GSER, or you as funders, can put into place for your staff, right? So just wanted to name those as sort of like 3 strategies that are rising to the top as it relates to planning for termination, right, for DACA in mid-2024. But from a long-term perspective, again, echoing what my colleagues have already shared, it's about ongoing investment in narrative and power building work. It's about putting money into movement infrastructure. It's also about fighting for pro-DACA wins at the state and local levels. I think Miranda commented specifically about investing in grassroots local organizations. That's the same thing we're talking about here, because even when federal relief isn't possible, there is potential for wins at the local and state level. In 2022, there were wins in places as diverse as Massachusetts and Arizona when it comes to immigrant rights. And that was really from grassroots groups organizing around key issues. And some of those issues include things like driver's license, tuition equity, health access, and licensure. Again, I'm about to say things which my colleagues have already shared, but when we think about philanthropy's role, and in light of these SCOTUS decisions that have and will continue to render women, LGBTQ, BIPOC, immigrant, and other communities vulnerable, it is critical that philanthropy bring an intersectional analysis, right, and are making those connections, and bring that analysis to bear in resourcing movement work to safeguard rights and preserve our multiracial democracy. Funders should support efforts not just to respond to the threat of DACA termination, but also fund in ways that enable solidarity work and movement work over the long term. Again, as my colleagues have already shared, we see these attacks and these cases that are before the Supreme Court of a piece. They're a part of a long-term concerted strategy. And to Michelle's point earlier, we need to be thinking in that same way, collectively and over the long term. So again, just to reiterate, in terms of DACA specifically, investing in grantee and community mental health and well-being, putting more money into legal services to support folks with respect to other possible immigration legal remedies. Also to look at things like what work participation strategies that do not require authorization look like entrepreneurship. And then of course, really putting a lot of money into narrative work, but not just from a campaign standpoint, but from a long-term sort of relational organizing standpoint. And along those lines, I also want to really amplify the work of an incredible network that we partner with at GSER. I do not claim any credit for, but I really want to uplift their work. And that's the Undocumented in Philanthropy Network, which is made up primarily of both currently and formerly documented recipients who are leaders within philanthropy. And for those of you who are interested in learning more about the long-term organizing work that they're doing, I can put you in contact with those folks. Michelle, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you. Sorry, I was taking notes. I'm a participant as much as I'm a moderator. So we actually have quite a bit of time to open it up to the floor for any questions. For the panelists, any strategies that you all in the audience, both physically here in the room and those that are joining us via Zoom, that you all may be thinking through as foundation staff and leaders. For those in the room, we ask that you use the mic. We have a floating mic because if you do not, the people on Zoom cannot hear you. So any questions folks might have for any of the panelists? And if you could please introduce yourself and the foundation you're with, that would be fantastic.
Hi, I'm Sorian Schmidt, and I'm with the Z. Smith Reynolds Foundation. And I'm just wondering, especially on the affirmative action piece, if you could talk a minute about how that applies to private entities as opposed to public entities. So maybe that's too legal, but I'm just like trying to understand how that plays out when you're just this private entity that's focusing on an area. You don't have quite the same requirements as a public one.
Susan, do you think you could answer that question?
Not being the expert on this, so if there's anybody else that can contribute, but I do think there is a difference whether or not you're public or private. A lot of this is going to focus on the use of public dollars or where public dollars flow and the ability to use race, right, in a decision. So I think that's right. I don't have enough understanding about implications on private, but there is that difference when public dollars are engaged. And it's interesting because there's a very large, many of you may know, fund in California supporting Black communities and Black organizations, and looks like they might be at the precipice of getting some state dollars donated to that fund. And the concern is about what that will do, because already some legislation's on the books in states like California about using race as a factor in decision making. So there are implications when public dollars, clearly, I think the implications are larger when the public dollars are engaged.
I can jump in really quickly if it's helpful.
Yes.
I know a little bit about it. The danger of knowing something is like, you're not sure of this. I mean, so historically, a lot of the affirmative action cases, they set the tone, right, for then hiring decisions in private entities. So they are the foundational cases, right, for legal precedent that then impacts private employers. So even though like immediately there might not be a ready application to a private entity, because those so as an example, hiring decisions have basis in affirmative action cases in educational institutions, they will have impact. At some point, I have a feeling, right, folks are probably waiting for this case to get decided, and they're going to start filing their cases
Yeah.
then bring it into all the other
Yeah.
spheres that we're in.
Yeah, I know that will happen. Thank you, Marissa.
If I may add, there's also private sector implications in the sense of the pipeline of talent, right? So you see in states where they removed affirmative action programs, decrease in the enrollment of certain groups of color, Black women, et cetera, in these colleges. And that means that when even if there aren't shifts in hiring practices, there's de facto shifts because you have less of the pool. There's already issues around income inequality, and it exacerbates those issues. So I think that even if there isn't explicit legal consequences, there are collateral consequences in this change that's going to impact public sector and private sector.
And I'll add that as a follow-up to this session, we're going to be hosting a session with a lawyer to help address more on the nitty-gritty legal implications. So we'll send that information out to you all as well.
Any other questions from anyone in the room or on Zoom?
Good afternoon, Ken Chapman, Democratizing Justice Initiative. Question is really around the likely response to some of these decisions and sparking uprising and protest. And just thinking about the state repression we've seen on protesters here recently, it escalating over the last several years. And just thinking about like what funders are thinking about safety and security of their grantees in these moments, as well as the kind of long-term legal infrastructure necessary to make sure that we're protecting our people. And so I was just wondering if folks on the panel or if other grant makers had some thoughts on that.
Any of the panelists want to tackle that one? Or anyone in the audience?
I would just say that, you know, the route in which we're going around sort of building out legal protection and legal strategy clearly, I think speaks to the gentleman's comment. You know, I think we all have been hearing about the issues around security and, you know, individual funders are doing individual things. I think we need to see more, you know, of a field strategy around the issue of security, given the current climate and what is coming with these decisions. So, you know, I would just say, just, you know, individual foundations, I'm hearing about response. I think we have so much more to do around field-wide response.
For folks on Zoom or in the here physically in the room, any strategies that your foundations might already be discussing, talking about that maybe you might be willing to share today? Has anyone already been discussing this at their foundations or with their boards, and if you've developed any strategies?
Hi, this is Dennis Quirin with the Rakes Foundation. It's an early and emerging conversation in some of the networks that we're investing in. We do a lot of funding in the education space, and you know, in the last couple of years, you all know there's been an incredible backlash around equity in education. That's a coordinated political attack. We're seeing some organizations that were not ever thought of as political in any way being sort of, you know, targeted. There's things like Project Veritas that sort of are doing the kind of gotcha fake reporting. So it's within that network of education funders who haven't necessarily thought in this way. There's some, we're trying to elevate the conversation and begin to do some research around security, both physical security and digital security, general practices, both for the foundations and for organizations. But it's early stage, actually. And I think there are certain parts of the kind of change ecosystem that have been in the physical fight, and it's not early stage. And so I think there are lessons that would be useful for other parts of other issue areas, and also for sure philanthropy. And I would say kind of for philanthropy, there's an increasing understanding that foundations are probably going to be getting different kinds of threats and attacks that would be, a part of a political strategy to chill funding. That will be wildly successful if we don't elevate the conversation. Like even just a chill will deplete dollars or shift them away from some clarity of purpose work. So at the Rakes Foundation, we've begun to start that conversation with the trustees and with some staff, and beginning to do some due diligence around security firms and just how to even think about like doing the cross your T's and dot your I's work before anything happens. But I just, we are in a political time, and issues that were not thought of as political or in the political fray are, and that's pretty soon going to be everything. It's a much longer conversation, and a conversation about sort of within the philanthropic perspective, what do field leading foundations do to protect themselves and to get to sort of put messages, and by field leading, I mean places like the Ford Foundation, for instance, and how can we all sort of understand better how to support some of these entities and keep this conversation going in ways that we can all prepare ourselves. And that's a responsive part of the strategy. And then what is the proactive piece that follows?
I can jump in. Hi, this is Jane Kibondo with Crossroads Fund in Chicago. I'm missing out. Just a few thoughts coming up in the fact that attacks have been there since the dawn of democracy, or fighting for our own survival, right? So just bearing that in mind, and whether it's a civil rights or from the Underground Railway, just like all those movements have had attacks and danger. So maybe this is a moment we ask, where's our skin in the game, right? And what does it mean to have skin in the game? And thinking about the activists we work with, and how many times are they picked up from a crowd, or how many times are they incarcerated, even as we speak right now in Atlanta, right, with the Cop City and all the organizing that's going there. So developing that muscles, like we're not immune, and this work is personal. It's about our communities, and it's about our communities through thick and thin. So I feel like that going in will give us an edge. And for Crossroads Fund, what we've done is just like really, we've had our own issues around follow the money. What does it mean to follow the money? And it comes to you. Or because we're a public foundation, also, where does the money come from? So maybe somebody wants to attack a bigger foundation, but they can come through us, right? Just being very cognizant of that. But just trying to build that muscle with the board members. Like, if this scenario happens, how do we respond? If this happened, the same way we're talking about the communication strategy, worst case scenario, like all these things are in place. So by the time it comes up, we already have, because the first time we introduced it, everybody was freaking out, like, oh my gosh, we're all going to go out and under and all that. But now the more we talk about it, the more it becomes a much more nuanced conversation. So if anything comes down, or if we have to take a stand, the muscle has been built, right? And just seeing the same attacks as attacks on the institution. And what does that mean? And I know, Dennis, you mentioned like Ford Foundation, but I also want to say, like, the ones who are closest to the ground also have a bigger risk. Ford Foundation, they might go for Ford because there's more money there. But the us without money, it's even like, you're going to like, it won't even take long to destroy us like a bit. So just like muscles. And then the last thing is like, I think, Susan, you mentioned it, like what happens if Crossroads is attacked? Like who's coming for us? Who's coming to defend us? Right? So what does that even, what does solidarity among ourselves mean? Especially those who are taking a stand or saying that we're going to stick with this to the end. What happens? Like I'd hate to be left out to dry because nobody came for us, right? Like why are we being left to dry? So just thinking about these things and thinking about worst case scenario, but also how do we take care of each other? So, but thanks so much.
You know,
Hi. Hi everyone, Anna Fink with the Amalgamated Foundation. Yeah, I think the questions Dennis and Jane are raising about philanthropy and both how foundations protect themselves, but do that in a way that's not distancing ourselves from the risk and the risk that field leaders are taking on, I think is really important. I think there's a tendency in philanthropy to sort of, create stronger grant agreements that insulate ourselves and things like that. And I really think in this moment, we need to think about how we're sharing in that risk that our grantees are taking and supporting them and being smart, and also doing that with our own institutions, but not sort of doing it in a way that we're not helping absorb that risk. I was going to ask another question for the folks who shared, which is, given the sort of magnitude of the court attacks on our communities and our rights, are folks thinking or talking at all together about strategies to broaden the court, shift the court? There's clear corruption happening in the court. How is that part of either strategies or tables or conversations that folks are a part of?
That's a great question. I will say that those particular strategies related to expanding the court and also addressing the corruption on the court aren't ones that we've been a part of or our movement and field partners have been a part of, right? The explicit focus has been more on the legal strategy, assuming what the ruling will be in June of 2024. But I will say also that there is this discussion around like, what's the long-term work to sort of look at the bench in multiple places around the country, right? To get the right, to get good new nominees into place. But I would say, at least from our perspective and in the networks that we're a part of, kind of like thinking about that court expansion question and the addressing the corruption are not at the sort of top of the list.
Not on ours either, but I appreciate the proposal, and this is the forum for us to just put some thoughts on the table, because this is a strategy about courts. This is a game about, it's a legal game. We often talk about policy in the sector and this is a legal game. And so I just appreciate the question, and we'll be thinking about that. Yeah.
We haven't been talking about this explicitly at my foundation, but we have a long history of giving multi-year general operating support to civic engagement work and democracy-focused work. And so I think the ecosystem, when giving that kind of money over long term, the ecosystem that you build includes some of these pieces that you're talking about. And I think so for example, we have some legal groups that litigate regularly on, for example, gerrymandering or voting rights and all that kind of stuff. But they also then frequently are representing Black elected officials, because once they're elected, they're often sued as soon as they do anything. And so, or they're sued saying the election wasn't fair, whatever, the whole elections challenge. And so we have within our ecosystem like these attorneys that will represent people. We don't have enough. When people are marching to the polls and they're getting picked up, we will bring, the ecosystem will bring in additional attorneys to represent them, but there's not probably enough, certainly not enough to absorb these new attacks. But I think, really for the long-term strategy, I would say we already do have at least some states where there's been more investment nationally, and maybe an investor like us in the state that will do multi-year general operating support. You have an ecosystem in the democracy space that hopefully is going to have some of these different components. There are weaknesses and gaps in those regardless, and it's cyclical funding. And so, those things are challenges, but I just think it's something we could build on, is sort of how I'm thinking about this right now. On the other hand, I think this is a whole new level of challenge that we haven't been faced with. Oh, I'm Sorian Schmidt with the Z. Smith Reynolds Foundation. We fund in North Carolina.
Was there anyone on Zoom? I feel like before Anna spoke, someone on Zoom was about to speak. Was there anyone on Zoom that wanted to share anything? So we also wanted to collect needs, especially as NFG is thinking about, right, how to support the philanthropic community through this. And as Adriana already stated, they're going to put something together with, legal counsel to offer, to talk people through this. But what are other needs that you all might have as philanthropic leaders and staff to be able to talk to your trustees about this, to be able to help your foundation move towards some sort of decision? I think particularly around affirmative action, and maybe this is naive of me, I have no doubt that folks will jump to support DACA, depending on that decision. It's the affirmative action one that makes me very nervous, because we're already seeing in Chicago foundations pulling back from language and pulling back and even changing language on website and public facing materials. So would love to hear from you all so that we can collect whatever needs you might have so that NFG can support the community, the philanthropic community.
Sorry, this is Soren Schmidt again from Z. Smith Reynolds. I mean, one, I need, and it's probably out there, I need to find the one-pagers that describe the case, and I'm sure our attorneys will have opinions. But two, I think, people have been talking about the messaging, but I think the sooner we're working on that and sharing that, the better. And I love that you brought in someone that could talk about Dobbs and the response to that. And I think the sharing of best practices needs to be managed constantly, so we can meet together in a safe space to share, best practices and even failures. I mean, we already, similar to what you're saying, we have a major foundation that's completely backed off all their race-based giving. I mean, it's mind-boggling what's happening there. And so, and the implications of it and the connections of that particular philanthropy to others are huge. And so I would love to hear, what are other people seeing? How are they dealing with that inside their own philanthropies? I mean, those are the two big ones that stand out to me. Like, how do you talk about this? What's some good language? What's worked? What hasn't? And then, how are you dealing with things as they because we can already see some of the stuff unraveling. So how do you recommend deal with it? Oh, I know the other one. Susan mentioned scenario planning. I'd love to see, sample scenario planning that we could, so we don't have to start from ground zero, that we can start maybe a little higher in the discussion.
Hi, this is Dennis with Rakes Foundation again. First, I just want to say this has been an excellent panel. I've really, I think there's been a lot of really useful information shared about the interface between the courts and the work that we all do in different ways. So I just want to make sure to say that. On the last point, I think those are some good things to think about. I'm thinking from a kind of a practical perspective, there will absolutely be foundations that are going to roll back their language and their funding. And I want to see if there's a way to make a distinction between language and funding, or language and like communications and strategy. And if there's guidance around how to support people that feel the need to change their communications, but to not completely change their grant making. I mean, I wonder about that as well, because I think it's inevitable that you're going to see some of that. And so the question is, you know, the ultimate purpose of the philanthropic world really is to finance change work. So how do you, if needed, bifurcate a bit between the words on the website and the work that is moving in the world? It may not be possible to completely bifurcate those things, but it's almost like a, yeah. So anyways, I think that's the point. And so guidance around how to think and communicate to our peers about not losing sight of purpose and of the things that everybody knew to be true a couple of years ago. And I'll just say, I see it already. I mean, there's already like a change in the comfort in speaking, saying racial justice, you know, and it's super frustrating. But just to get clear on that ultimate purpose of continuing to move the resources like that, like how to create that lane for folks and what folks like us can do to support that.
Anyone on Zoom, any needs that any of you might have?
This is really helpful. And just to respond to you, Dennis, I mean, I really see in the conversation with legal counsel, a real need around the messaging support. And I think I know of the case that the colleague from Z. Smith was talking about as well, what happened there. But this sort of balance between explicit and implicit work on racial justice, and there actually is guidance that exists, right? For foundations, we need to lift that up and make that more visible. But I think that's going to be the rub, because what I've heard a lot is that people are looking to figure out how they message the work moving forward, particularly post the SCOTUS decision, but not stop the work, right? And it's hard because we work so hard to get here. But that's the way some folks are going to roll, and we don't want to lose the money, to your point. So I'm in agreement with you.
Hi, this is Mark Paley from Hyams Foundation in Boston, and we're a place-based foundation. And I'm wondering about the connection between place-based and national, and the supports that can be offered on a more localized effort.
Should I ask? Oh, okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Kelly Suzanne Salisbury with Woods Fund Chicago. And so I have a reflection since we've been thinking a lot at Woods Fund about messaging and strategy, not only with our direct work, but of course our work with grantee partners and the communities they work with. And it seems like given the, pending SCOTUS decision, as well as just already the attacks on, racial justice, social justice work, it seems to me it's going to be even more important for us as funders and foundations specifically to have like deepen relationships with our grantee partners and not have grant making processes that require explicit communication and a lot of narrative, right? But perhaps more conversations, one-on-ones, whether they're virtual or in person, and other opportunities for grantee partners to continue messaging their work in ways that perhaps will not be as risky to them, but where they can still speak to the work that they do and the impact that they want to make. I know that there are foundations already out there doing this, but it seems like relationship building and communications that are not burdensome, not only in terms of workload, but also could unfairly implicate our grantee partners, is going to be even more important. So if it's now's the time for us as funders to really look at our grant making processes and practices, period, but especially now.
Thanks, Kelly. I wanted to just circle back to the gentleman who asked a question before about place-based funding. I don't know if anyone on the panel wanted to speak to that.
Michelle, I'll make a comment. Mark, one of the things that comes to mind for me, like we need a field-wide strategy around these issues. First, to say that localizing these issues matters greatly, right? Because things will play out. Some things will play out nationally. Most things happen locally. And I know that for example, the board of the United Philanthropy Forum is in a very engaged conversation about this as well. I think there are some regional associations that are poised to organize locally, more conversations, provide access to tools and resources. And I think we need to get more regional associations there. So I appreciate your question, but just to say that this is a discussion happening with regional associations of grant makers. And so this is about how we use the infrastructure of philanthropy differently moving forward, because there's infrastructure there. And some are further along than others, but I'm hoping that some regionals will take more of a role in this work.
I have a question. This is Stephen Chaney. I'm with Neighborhood Funders Group. And I'm just wondering, just on this, on the larger strategy building and everything that y'all are talking about, are there any plans or considerations on that foundation should be thinking about or preparing for also on the June docket for ICWA? And I don't know, just appreciating if y'all have any like words, thoughts on that, just because it's happening in the same, realm of things. And ICWA, the Indian Child Welfare Act, if you're not familiar, is up for, they're considering striking it down, right? And that has a lot of implication on tribal sovereignty. And so just wondering if that's also something that y'all are thinking about, considering, and in any way. And if that question's not part of what we're talking about here, apologies, it's just on my mind, and I think it is related to what the discussion.
Yeah, I will just say thank you for that. I know Native Americans in Philanthropy is heavily engaged on this issue. I can't talk about the particulars of the strategy, but one of the firms that they're using around their messaging campaign is the firm that we are considering hiring around the affirmative action and messaging campaign. So I would check in with Eric Stegman and folks at Native Americans in Philanthropy. They are deep on that issue. Yeah.
Thank you.
I was just to say, like, I again appreciate the question, and it's just to me a reminder, or it underscores some of the strategies that my colleagues already offered. You know, Susan was talking about organizing legal counsel at foundations, and also, you know, the idea of having a field-wide strategy, a philanthropic field-wide grant-making strategy as it relates to the way that these legal issues are manifesting, right? Like, it's very well thought out in the opposition in terms of, again, like all the issues we've been naming are of a piece. And so similarly, how on the philanthropic side, or at least the philanthropic networks, I'm making an assumption that we're all a part of, are we thinking in that same sort of field-wide strategy kind of way, right? Thinking about the way cases move from the district court, which circuits like cases get appealed in, or move through, and then connecting the dots in that way.
This is Michelle Gislison, and I work with Philanthropy Forward. I wanted to surface a need that I heard this morning in the plenary, also something that I've heard throughout Philanthropy Forward as fellows started raising the issue of the SCOTUS docket, and that is that how are white anti-racist leaders in philanthropy organizing around this in a couple ways. One is that Black and brown leaders are saying, who's got our backs? Because we're the ones who are stepping forward in all of this. So that's one piece. The other piece is that for the most part, Black and brown leaders are the ones who are actually raising the issues of SCOTUS and what's coming. And so who is doing the heavy lift in this really matters. And so that's just something I know in Philanthropy Forward, we're starting that conversation, but I want to elevate it here as well, because I think that there's some work and some self-organizing that could be happening.
I'm trying to get better at, you know, the pregnant pause. I'm not good at it. All right, I think what I'm going to do is pass the mic to Adriana. She's going to share with the room, the physical room and the virtual room, the current cohort of Philanthropy Forward is working on a call to action letter, and she is going to raise that, share it with the room, share what the themes of that letter is.
Thanks, Michelle. So similar to the Philanthropy Forward cohort is a fellowship is organized by Neighborhood Funders Group and Aspen Forum for Community Solutions. And my colleague Cindy Santos is in the room in person representing Aspen Forum. We have been working with 4 cohorts of fellows that are CEOs in philanthropy that are funding racial and gender justice work. And it's an exciting network that we're now in the 4th cohort of, and our 4th cohort members are the ones that really brought this issue to us and our attention, and wanting to organize colleagues to connect and address and to share a call to action. Some of the call to actions definitely will be influenced by this conversation, and you know we'll have the sense of funding the infrastructure, continuing to fund the infrastructure, funding for the long term, and creating the support needed, having some follow-up sessions as well in terms of legal counsel to have more of conversations about legal implications for foundation leaders. And Cindy, please add anything I missed.
I would say the last thing is what's already been covered, which is really increasing solidarity, right? So how do we really look across these issues and ensure that we do have each other's backs, that we are sharing strategies, that this is a really coordinated, concerted effort. And I think the purpose of the call to action is to be able to really identify some of those strategic things that we could be doing together and collectively to ensure that we are prepared. And I think a piece of what we talk about in the statement is we want to be preemptive, we want to be current, and we want to be long-term thinking. And so I think that's just an important piece of what we're trying to do with the call to action.
If there's anyone in the room or on Zoom that is interested in seeing the draft of the letter or potentially might want to consider signing on, please talk to Cindy or to Michelle. For those in the Zoom, maybe, say yes in the chat so Adriana can take it down. We're still drafting it and are trying to finalize it, but it is something, as Cindy said, that I'm in the current cohort, that's why I'm saying that we want as many foundations as possible to sign on to. I think, we may be ending this early, guys, so you're gonna have some time back on your hands, which is fantastic. But Jane raised, I think, are super important. Jane always does this. Jane is my colleague in Chicago. She always comes onto Zooms or into meetings, says something profound, drops the mic, and then goes on mute. And she said, how are we showing up for one another? And I'm not sure that's a question that's really asked often in philanthropy. We're asked how we show up for grantee partners, how we show up for the communities that we're in service to, but there is also how do we show up for one another. Jane, our two foundations were named in a lawsuit a year ago. And we had to coordinate with one another around the lawsuit. We were sued for potentially providing funding to a group of organizers that disrupted a conference. And so I raised that because luckily, since we work so closely together already, we worked closely together around that. But that is, I think, a sign of the times to come, right? Will the right use this as a concerted effort to attack not only grantees, but also the folks that fund them, right? And so, as Michelle said, how are we showing up for BIPOC leaders in this sector? As Jane said, how are we showing up for the smaller foundations who are more at risk, the public foundations? And then how do we as a field really think about this long term and not just a short-term crisis?
Ken Chapman, Democratizing Justice again. Just actually on the long-term nature of this, my grandmother would use the expression, throw a stone into the future. What comes after this wave of attacks, this wave of rollbacks? What's in the pipeline that is maybe kind of bubbling up, and if possible, just underscoring the importance of getting this particular moment right because of what's on the horizon as well.
Any insight, Marissa, Susan, Miranda, any insight into what potentially is in the pipeline beyond this?
I don't know if it's in the pipeline. I think we're seeing it. It's a great question. It's a depressing question. And I don't mean you're depressing, but I'm thinking about the overwhelm of, right? And these are just some aspects, but right, in terms of our space, we'll become more highly carceral. We're already a carceral country. It'll be even more so. The borders will continue to manifest themselves in multiple ways. We will become an even more policed state, I think, in many different spheres. We will also we will become even more ahistoric than we already are. It's a very ahistoric time that we're in. And there is activism, right, to ensure that much of our history is actually erased or invisibilized. So again, I'm sorry that I'm a bummer, but those are the three things that I think about in terms of what will continue to emerge and happen.
I don't want to be the bummer either, Marissa, but one of the things I am most concerned about, and I used to think it was far-fetched and not talk about it publicly, but I realize I do now more. I am concerned that the next attack will be on the 501c3 status of organizations that are explicit around their racial justice work. They're focused on Black communities and the like. And so again, in the notion of scenario planning, right, what do we do about that? If that, that maybe it won't come. But the severity of the attacks and the way in which they're rolling out, I think we need to consider that. I think we need to consider that. And what might that mean? Again, scenario planning.
I just want to say to Jane Mondo at Crossroads Fund again, just want to say thank you to Michelle. But there's something else that came up with what Susan said, and just in thinking, the lawsuit Michelle brought up was actually from a community of color. So it's not like, but sometimes we have this images like it's a white supremacist organization coming, but it's also, yeah, it was, and hired a lawyer that came for us, right? And it's this chain of follow the money. So I think also knowing where the attacks can come from, it could be from being accused of being anti-Semitic to who you funded to so this affirmative action opens the door to, it's like open season, right? And so some of the things we're doing is, even if you're not changing the language, like in one whole fund that we have, the fact that we say that we fund Black-led organizations and those working on anti-Blackness. So now that clause of working on anti-Blackness makes it, on the face of it, okay. Then the lawsuits will be like, I applied for a grant and I did not get because my organization is white or white-led. And therefore, so sometimes the burden is on the other person to prove that's what it is. And there is a pattern. But I think the implications, what was being asked is like the amount of time it takes for those lawsuits, what it takes us away from. And just like the angst, like I thinking about Crossroads, we're 41 years old. I'm a Black woman who's running this organization as a first person. So it's going to be closed on my shop, right? I mean, and it can, right? So there is also those things that are like will weigh on us, whether it's actually going to lead to something. But just like at what point you said this hot potato is too hot and I'm out. So I mean, so just the ripple impact. And Michelle, I am going on Zoom again, off Zoom again, but I'm here listening actively, or I'll stay.
Can I respond to that? Thank you for that, Jane. Who came for us at AppFi was a person of color as well. I just want to say that. So let's be clear about, what's happening here. It's not just, sort of white boogeymen or whatever. But just what you said, you nuanced the framing of the work that you do that provides, some leeway in a potential court case and the like, and that's what I'm hearing. And so that's when I talk about messaging, sort of lifting up how folks are navigating this climate with framing the work in ways that give them cover so the work can continue. We want to compile those strategies, organize those strategies for the field. So I appreciate that. Yeah.
I try to be real and pragmatic, but also hopeful. And you mentioned quoting your grandmother, and like I felt like my grandmother could do anything. I say that to say, and I also have a little baby that you might see running around here at the conference. And so I feel like I have to remain hopeful for her sake. And one of the things that has recently given me hope about the future is, although it was an incredibly traumatic event and will continue to have global consequences, one of the bright spots of the pandemic was, for me, expanding what was possible. So things that I thought would never be possible in terms of compassionate release of people who were incarcerated, or eviction prevention and halting. It is my hope that there is an expanded possibility that this moment will drive us to. Just like I'm confident that my grandmother can do anything, I'm confident that Susan and AppFi can do so much. So I think that it's important to keep that in mind. It's important to say that. I think that we've seen Black women, people of color, movement leaders do things that felt impossible. So I think part of our work also is making sure that there is that we are pouring into and sustaining each other. So there's lots of talk about collaboration and resource sharing. I think a piece of the puzzle is also saying, Susan, what do you need?
I think that that is an excellent note to close on. I don't think I need to add anything after that. So thank you so much, Miranda, for sharing that. And thank you all for participating today, for coming to this session. We really appreciate your participation, your questions, and your ideas around strategy. Again, if there are any needs that come up for you, please do not hesitate to email the NFG team so that they can coordinate any programming to help address any needs. Thank you to the panelists as well.
Thank you.